Our speaker of the day has been involved in acoustic ecology for over 14 years, where she works across the fields of urban soundscape research, sonification for public engagement, as well as gender and sound in video games. She is assistant professor and the Glenn Fraser Endowed Professor at Simon Fraser University. She's also a sound walking enthusiast, published widely in the areas of acoustic ecology, media and game studies, design and technology. The title of her lecture is Gendered Ecologies, Voice and the Game Soundscape of Bayonetta. Please welcome with me Dr. Milena Droumeva.
Thank you everyone for being here. Thank you, Professor Breitsamita, for inviting me. It's really great, actually, having been involved in acoustic ecology for a long time, to be able to combine some of my other passions and bring them to this venue and share it with some of the core people in acoustic ecology. Actually, Hildegard Westerkamp, for example, has never even heard me speak on this topic, and so there's new things always. Yeah. I imagine that a lot of you today maybe don't play games, and maybe you're here sort of curious and wondering, why should I care? And so I kind of want to start with, why should you care? Games are I want to draw a random number, $6 billion industry. It's a huge industry. It's a huge media entertainment industry. Any of us who are doing media studies need to care about games. Games also are at a very interesting crossroads between media entertainment and the tech sector. So when we start thinking about gender dynamics, especially in the tech center, they really play out in the context of gaming very, very, very clearly, very distinctly. So in a sense, my talk today is about making some of those dynamics, some of those gender dynamics apparent. And I'm using a very specific case study of a game called Bayonetta for the Nintendo Wii. I'll be playing lots of examples, so you'll have your own chance to see what it sounds like. Okay. In the past decades, the world of video games has experienced several great disruptions, including the sweeping emergence of a broad range of games, a growing public conversations about the gender politics of games as systems of representation. And such conversations directly challenge the normativity of game cultures and industries as exclusive spaces for men and boys. Consequently, women with a public voice have been targeted, and in many cases silenced through online campaigns of harassment. One question to ask is, how are the ecologies of voice reflective of and constructive by the actual media soundscapes in games? How does the larger ecology of education and professional training perpetuate these often sexist stereotypes? So applying an ecological lens borrowed from soundscape studies, this talk is my attempt to map the social ecologies of the female voice and its manifestation in game soundscapes, or the feminized voice, I should say. Of course, one of the most obvious ways to think about game soundscapes and ecologies is to consider environmental sound design in games. And on that front, game design has come a long way. So let's hear an example. This is a game called Horizon Zero Dawn. It's a fairly contemporary game, and it also features a female protagonist, and in a very good light, I think. But I won't be discussing that. I just want to give you an example of how the soundscape of games has improved ecologically, one might say. You gotta do what you gotta do. So here we have complex, almost cinematic layering of sounds in a sort of functional rather than realistic ecology. And I say functional because we can hear the sounds that are informationally important much more crisply than they would sound in real life. Like, for example, the killing of the turkey or the overriding of the machine horse. They stand out, really, quite a lot. Yet, we hear almost no masking. The environmental and musical layers fade in and out conveniently with the flow of gameplay. So on one hand, we have this functional soundscape ecology, almost idealized in a way that Schaefer speaks about masking. We have little masking. But how do we talk about gendered soundscapes? What does this have to do with gender? Well, I want to play you one other small examples. Let's notice what's happening here in terms of sonic gestures and the relationship between different elements. This is Lara Croft. This is from a very long-standing title, one of the first serious adventure games with a female main character called Tomb Raider.
Oh God, no. What is this place? What happened to you? I told you.
This is a relatively classic title as far as iconic female characters in gaming. Lara Croft. Lara has been the subject of controversy from very early versions on, as her image from the beginning was unnecessarily sexualized. With very little clothing, she wore very short shorts and a crop top, with very large breasts. In fact, this was a joke in the game development community. Someone made a mistake in the physics of the character and they kind of turned up the size of her breasts way too much. Here in this 2013 version, Lara has appropriate clothing and proportions. There has been a lot of uproar over the years, and so some things have changed, indeed, in the games industry in terms of visual representation. But did you notice something in this clip? She sounds like a scared little girl, and she sounds like that the whole entire game. In other words, her frailty, her femininity, and a certain kind of pornographic service is delivered via her voice. In fact, there was talk in the games community about how pornographic she sounded, so much so that even fans noticed it and talked about it. And this was supposedly rectified in the 2015 version, but it's arguable. So the sound mixing of the game specifically puts her breathy moans of fear and pain right at the very forefront of our listening. It's very tactile, it's very, very close up in terms of the kind of layers of sound design and mixing. In fact, this is the experience in the entire game. Lara running for her life, gasping and screaming in pain. And no matter how expertly you play the game, you would still be this character who is, constantly frightened and weak and struggling against the environment. So on one hand, we have the increasing complexity of functional sound in games. And on the other end of the spectrum, we have some quite entrenched gendered ways of voicing female characters, and I would argue gendered ways of constructing game soundscapes, of mixing even. They don't come from nowhere. Mediatized female voices have long served to enhance dramatic effect across a range of media, cinema being the most prominent, where female vocalizations have become symbolic of several primary things: fear, weakness, seduction, or hysteria. Think, for example, of the scream queen trope in horror film, especially, where, in order to have a really scary action happen, there has to be a girl going, right? Right. No, I didn't want to do that on the microphone. I turned that down for your benefit. And lots of people have spoken about that, and I'll mention a few theorists. In previous work, I have actually explored, I've been doing this for about 3 years, I've explored the battle cry in fighting arcade games as a gender trope of game avatar embodiment. One that has in fact taken on more overtly sexualized and stereotypically feminized characteristics with the game industry's evolution as a genre. A content analysis of historical patterns of some of the most widely played classic arcade games reveals that these sonic tropes are quite persistent, and we see them replicated across genres. Not in small part because of educational frameworks of sound design for the games industries and voice actor training. So professional training and professional development perpetuating that. The first sonic pattern is, I call hearing her limits. And the Lara Croft example is a great example of that. It's even when the female character is strong and an action hero, and otherwise has a clear, confident tone of voice, they're always a bit breathier. There's always a lot more breath. The recording technique is very close-mic'd compared to other male characters that I've looked at. And there are a lot more exertion sounds, so sounds of effort, sounds of running, climbing, jumping. They're always a bit more like, going up and very exaggerated. Then there are male counterparts. So in essence, we are made to hear their limitations in a very palpable way as they traverse the environment, as they fight off whatever enemies come their way. The next pattern I called 50 Shades of Witch. I never really read that book, but you gotta make an illusion, Referring to the type of alto voice that can be traced back to early operatic traditions of the typology of the alto and the mezzo-soprano as sultry, sort of morally corrupted women. So popular media builds on that operatic trope to encompass the trope of the witch. The witch is a seductress, she's morally ambiguous, her vocal traits of low drawl, creaking and growling, hey, what, allow for a kind of sexualized teasing for a presumed male auditor. The cute, sexy trope of the hentai ninja evokes a kind of pornographic innocence. If she's unaware but overflowing with sexuality, she's overly apologetic in fighting games. There's a lot of, hitting followed by, sorry, excuse me, want to see my kung fu? I've listened to these so many times, that's actually a fairly accurate, if I may say so myself, vocalization. So, those gals tend to be overly apologetic, playful, giggly, delighted, reactive. Their voice is often artificially pitched up, very light, very breathy, almost squealy, kind of reaching the heights of the counter soprano. In some of my earlier work, I compared operatic traditions of voice with their counterparts in media cultures, actually, because they really can be traced, even though you may think of opera and contemporary cinema or games as having nothing in common, but they do. There's a long history of replication. So this brings us to a definition I quite like given by Kate Lacey, of voice, which begins to articulate already a much more complex, multifaceted idea of the gendered voice as ecology. Voice, she says, is one of those apparently simple everyday words that have astonishingly prismatic qualities. It is a term that at once encapsulates ideas of the body, identity, expressiveness, and subjectivity, as well as ideas of agency, opinion, and political participation. So this talk today is about some of the limits of orality in the analysis of voice in video games. And it starts by considering games as both sonic and cultural ecologies. What does it mean in this sense to think ecologically? What are the ecologies of voice and gender in video games? Of course, ecological thinking in terms of sound is not new. Schaeffer's idea of acoustic ecology marked the beginning of a global phenomenon of attention to sound and listening across transdisciplinary fields of music education, urban studies, communication, many others. Acoustic ecology, however, and we've alluded to in some of our conversations here, has long been criticized for lacking in political dimensions, intersectional approaches, and critical perspectives. And I am excited to see those come to the foreground in recent times. This is an opportunity then to test the limits of an ecological theory of sound in the realm of critical media studies. Using an ecological lens, this work aims to map the social ecologies of the voice in relation to its manifestation in game soundscapes, which are already gendered media texts. In other words, sounding out the gendered body opens up different ways of exploring intentional and canonical designs of characters. It allows us to trace the relationship to educational systems of sound design. Now let's take a look at a case study of a game that has stirred a lot of controversy in terms of its gender representation of the female lead of Bayonetta. This is part of the opening cinematic of the game, and I hope you're as shocked as I am every time I watch it. Even though I have confession, I have played this game from beginning to end. I love it, but it's also, and it's a great case study because it's so problematic and entertaining at the same time. There's more. I know when I shoot guns, I do it in this pose. So I promise I'll contextualize things and it'll become to click into place what this is all about. The opening of Bayonetta 2, this is the opening cinematic of Bayonetta 2, is itself a metaphor for the character and gameplay of Bayonetta. It's over the top, it's dramatic, it's sexy, sultry, performative, carnivalesque, really. Since its launch in 2009, the game has been discussed extensively in terms of its main heroine, the witch Bayonetta, and particularly whether or not she is a strong female character or a prime example of the highly sexist representation of women that we often see in gaming. The game itself is undeniably sexualized, obviously. Starting with Bayonetta's character, look and feel. She's an attractive witch with a model-esque body, acrobatic moves at times, quite often, in fact, simulating pole dancing moves. She has a very sultry voice that is used to taunt, tease, and dominate the supporting male characters and foes in the game world. The game's mechanics are no less overtly sexualized. Bayonetta's hair is the source of her demonic strength, but it is also her bodysuit, meaning that when she performs special magic moves, her hair lifts off from her body, leaving her naked. Her special moves also frequently involve kink-based punishments such as whipping, torture machines, etc. The levels of the game are termed climaxes, and enemy targeting involves a kiss imprint. So for those of you that game, you know that there's a targeting and there's like a kiss icon that shows up on enemies. And when she overpowers them, she blows them a kiss after she kills them. By the way, when I played this clip in a different presentation, somebody asked me what was with this Moon River song. Why was the song Moon River playing? Well, it is because she is a witch and her powers draw from the moon, and that's why Moon River. It's a witch reference. But also, yes, she is disrobed, and then she calls on the power of the moon, and her hair creates her bodysuit. Couldn't get more ridiculous than that, I think. So there seem to be two main camps of a public discourse, if we think of that discourse as an ecology, about Bayonetta. One that stages the game as ironically sexist and thus potentially empowering for women, and one that critiques the game as well as the design, documentation, and promotion as providing sexist fan service under the guise of ironic sexism. Fan service is a colloquial term referring to gratuitous imagery and content aimed at the sexual satisfaction of a presumed male gamer. So the fact that women in gaming wear little clothing, have exaggeratedly large breasts, and move in very sexually suggestive ways, all of that is colloquially termed fan service. So I want to offer here not so much a definitive verdict on Bayonetta's feminist merits, but a performative analysis of Bayonetta's vocalizations in the game in relation to conventions of the female voice. And I want to suggest ways of thinking of a character such as Bayonetta as a composite of contradictions, located in an ecology of design education that very much needs updating. This is just a very small example of the kind of public conversations that are happening about Bayonetta. Is she sexist? Is she not? It's shocking. It's not. Why is Nintendo doing it? This is a very strange title for Nintendo, by the way. Nintendo is a kind of a lower-end console industry. They provide a lot of educational games for children. So to have this sort of title on the Nintendo platform is unusual, I would say. So as any game title would, Bayonetta lives across many intersections of genre design, industry-driven economics, player and fan community support, and a discursive ecology of mainstream news, game journalism, and popular microblogging. And this graphic is my attempt at reflecting some of those ecologies. And I should say that It wasn't always the case, but in probably the last decade, there has been a lot of crosstalk between fan communities and game cultures and industry, meaning that industry has had to sort of listen to that public discourse and at times incorporate it, or at the very least respond to criticisms that are emerging from, you know, the ground level of fan communities. So this truly is a kind of a living, breathing ecology, and there are opportunities for intervention. So yet the particular ecology of public debate around Bayonetta alludes to an odd complexity. A refusal to declare Bayonetta sexist or feminist wholeheartedly, but instead pointing to some sort of uniqueness about her that defies tropes, yet simultaneously fits into them. When it comes to her voice, there is a lot of public conversation, and I'm pointing this out because that's not always the case. Sound doesn't often make a discussion topic, a hot discussion topic in gaming communities, but in this case it has. It is celebrated as sexy, particularly because of her taunting, sexually suggestive one-liners, which are delivered in a very posh, educated British accent, and that's not by accident either. That has particular cultural connotations. Drawing on media histories of the female voice, I want to complicate that conversation of her being a feminist character. Conventions of female voice acting in games are a subset of game design education, and in other words, the perpetuation of sonic patterns is a problem of the industry and industry education. In film theory, theorists like Marianne Duane and Kaya Silverman have already discussed the lower status of the disembodied female voice as an indicator of emotionality and affect, as well as the scream queen trope that is readily found in horror, but also in contemporary drama and notably in anime. And I'm talking about this sound.
No!
That last one, especially. I want to say something about the disembodied female voice. You may have noticed in the clip with Lara Croft in Tomb Raider, there's a lot of talking to herself about her fears, a lot of like, oh no, what is this? What happened? Whereas in very similar titles with a male protagonist, you will have things like, this doesn't seem right. Maybe I should go left. Inner monologue, inner dialogue is actually a really clever way to deliver instructions to the player. When you're struggling to figure out where to go, the characters talks to themselves and tells you what to do. Except for female characters very often talk to themselves about how scared and unsure they are and that they don't know what to do. So we really do see that psychoanalysis that Marianne Duane has created in film theory play out in video gaming as well. Video games are very much a continuation of the cinematic genre, and there's very living connections there too. Before delving into a sonic analysis of gender in Bayonetta, it's important to distinguish several different sets of vocal categories for the character of Bayonetta in terms of post-production voiceover work. So we have here all of these different categories of voice that are recorded almost completely separately. We have a database of battle cries, including offensive, defensive, and KO, or when the character is killed, vocalizations. We have a database of offhand phrases played on top of battle soundtracks during fighting sequences, and you'll hear an example in a moment of what that is. We have a database of incidental sounds, including jumping, running, sounds of effort, interaction with objects and magic. And we have the so-called cutscenes, or scripted voiceover work in cinematic cutscenes. And as you can imagine, the quality of recording is different, but also the quality of delivery here is different because a number of those sounds are called up in real time. So the database sounds are called up in real time depending on what the player is doing, whereas the cutscenes are mandatory. So when you achieve a certain stage in the game of the story, you will get a cinematic and everyone will get the same cinematic. So those are completely highly produced, high definition sort of vocal and visual work. These vocal aspects are, of course, combined with layers of musical background that depend on the thematic action or place, and with some atmospheric environmental sound that characterize the narrative game setting. In an interview with Nintendo Live, Helena Taylor, the voice actress who sounded out Bayonetta, states that she got very little direction as to how to voice Bayonetta, and imagined her as a kind of unattainable ideal of a woman, sexy, witty, strong, but also plagued by an inner void due to the missing memory of her past. Needless to say, Taylor also couldn't hear or see any of the other multi-sensory design elements of the game, leaving her to imagine the context and setting herself. So imagine here for a moment that this ecology that you're experiencing as a player, this sort of reality that you're experiencing as a player, was recorded on the part of Helena Taylor in a completely isolated voice booth with no information as to the storyline, no information as to what kind of space the character would be in, what kind of things would be happening. So completely, schizophrenic, if you will, on many, many levels than just one. Battle cries, grunts, exertion sounds for jumping, as well as coy phrases during fights are randomly generated sound effects called up by the game engine. Cutscene voice performance are fully recorded mini-zodes, like mini-episodes, in high visual and sonic quality. Those are triggered automatically. And it's important to keep in mind that each category of vocals is recorded separately from each other and without narrative or visual information. So I just want to underscore how Frankensteinian, in a way, this assemblage is of all of these different vocal elements in the context of the game as you're playing it. Let's now extend this analysis to the sound ecology of Bayonetta, the game. It's a linear RPG game with a lot of role-playing game, with a lot of button mashing, fight sequences. Bayonetta fits right into the canon of RPG games with a deep prioritization of natural, atmospheric, and spatial sounds in favor of special effect sounds. Environmental sounds reference only the most distinct part of a particular atmosphere. Rain, wind, indoor versus outdoor space, echoes, basically the cheap tricks of creating a space. The most distinct sounds associated with the character of Bayonetta are her stiletto footsteps, arguably referencing her overflowing femininity and command, as well as gaspy exertion sounds every time she jumps and runs around. Much of the narrative is supplemented with soft lounge jazz, which could be read as enhancing her overtones as a classy pole dancer. The game's many cutscenes feature Helena Taylor's sultry, educated London accent, delivering crushingly flirtatious and taunting lines to friends and foes alike. When I actually had two of these. These are her grunts. Very witchy, for lack of a better word. And this is the kind of sultry one-liners, that she delivers.
Keeping secrets from Mummy? No wonder your guardian angels are trying to give you a good spanking.
So the fighting sequences are saturated with magic, weapon, and special combo sound effects, which is typical for the genre. And it's important to note that fighting sequences take up easily about 75% of total gameplay for games like this one. So the battle cries and various battle vocalizations amount to a very significant listening time for each player. So I want to play an example of a battle scene and then kind of break it down. So from an acoustic ecology standpoint, these are extremely dense, chaotic soundscapes with a lot of masking and overlapping sounds due to the way that individual sound effects are called up and remixed live with the background music. The figure here shows a breakdown of relative sound levels of the 5 main sonic elements that comprise a fighting sequence: music, sound effects, voice, space. You'll notice nothing is louder and more bombastic than the weapon and magic sound effects. As a kind of staple of the genre, and Bayonetta in particular, these sound effects take up a large part of the listening spectrum. Since those are elements triggered by the player, they are often clustered tightly together and even interrupt each other and overlap. Her battle cries are breathy and guttural, connoting strength, yet lacking the luster and self-possession of her cinematic voice work. The voice work where she says things like, "keeping secrets from mommy." Her voice-off taunts are disconnected phrases that sit on top of the battle soundscape and are delivered with a great deal of reverberation, implying that they are her inner monologue. So things like, "Is that all you've got? So close." These phrases ring awkwardly in the moment, given that they sound out regardless of whether she's winning or losing at the time. And finally, an important unifying element in the ecology of battle sequences is the Japanese pop music playing in the background. A tip of the hat to the game's Japanese roots and anime crossover, J-pop stands in stark juxtaposition to Bayonetta's constructed racial persona as a white, posh dominatrix. The J-pop background seems more appropriate to the Final Fantasy franchise than a game that practically delivers softcore pornography to players. In essence, sound within the ecology of Bayonetta is referential rather than immersive or authentic. It signals to meanings already stored with the player, communities of genre game texts. These conventions extend also to the gendered style of vocalizations, as well as the sound mixing in real time. For instance, in terms of spatial environment, aside from several archetypal location markers like waterfalls or echoic buildings, the most present sound is her clear stiletto footsteps, which is a very feminized sound. And this is precisely the limitation of an ecological approach to soundscape analysis. By training and convention, both vocal work and background music choices reference the sexualized femininity of Bayonetta. The question isn't whether a less cluttered sound ecology will result in a more balanced sonic experience. The design choices made for Bayonetta are meant not only to conform to genre standards, but also to take advantage of popular conventions of the female media voice. In other words, voice actresses sound the way they do because they are trained to and asked to sound that way. A different approach to ecology, or perhaps ecology is not even the right metaphor, which is why I have this busy mesh image here. A different approach, one that transcends sonic dimensions, and one that I would argue offers more flexible framework for understanding and evaluating game soundscapes, is proposed by Fitzsimmons in relation to the documentary Voice. By deprioritizing the director's vision as central, Fitzsimmons proposes the notion of braided voices to refer to the interrelationships between filmmakers, subject, audience, broadcasters as ecologies that are co-constructive of this authorial voice. In the case of Bayonetta, the industry design decisions made about her, the author's voice, so to speak, offers a fairly stereotypical reading of the game as media and text. But we see from the experiences of players, and in particular female players, that the text has many alternate readings. The mashup of British accent and J-pop is a particular disharmonic sort of harmony that implies layers of significance of sonic elements. Even the absence of over-the-top screams of pain that is typical for female characters is a notable omission. A braided voice ecology would involve then the interplay between game design, industry, fan culture, conventions, and technology. So a sense of balance, or better yet, redress of crusty design, or intervention of crusty design conventions of female media voices could only happen through the shifting of this interplay. So what's the verdict? What does the sonic ecology of Bayonetta say about its supposed feminist merits? Well, her vocal presence seemed to offer both empowerment and sexualization in a variety of ways. The real issue lies not with sound ecology, but with sonic representation. Specifically, the kind of vocal dismemberment of the character where voice serves as oral objectification, literally sonic objects recorded separately and out of context, while also affirming the character as a strong and confident witch. Using sound as an object of analysis invites us to link the design process of Bayonetta's oral self to a multitude of vocalities, braided voices, which position her both as empowered, with her confident and aggressive, dominant battle cries, as a raised and classed character, elegant London accent in cutscene minisodes, as well as pornographically feminized, taunting, gasps, blowing kisses, orgasmic sounds, as we saw in the opening scene. And also a character that, according to fans, kind of resists objectification. So in that, Bayonetta is a deservingly complex character. The implication for education here is on one hand to look past the limitations of an ecological view of sound, and on the other to bring attention to the recycling of sexist sonic tropes and design patterns by looking at the social ecology of cultural works that bring about a media text such as Bayonetta. Acoustic ecology might bring with it the language of soundscape analysis, but it often fails at incorporating a critical lens, one that doesn't presuppose that a better, more ecological design is just within grasp. It's not so. In fact, sonic tropes persist because popular cultural texts, such as games, are embedded in wider design ecologies. We need to re-envision and inhere better sonic representations of women in media for a real change to happen. And for that, frankly, we also need more female designers who are speaking and hearing for themselves. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Milena Droumeva, for this fascinating subject. We still have some time for questions, and I guess some of you do have questions, so let's start.
Just to add to your analysis, I was also involved several years ago, I think it's 2 years now, in game studies and gamification at my university, and I think you've drawn a very good and clear picture of the situation.
Thank you.
And to add onto this, the gendered images are also not just very sexualized and very objectifying, but also super cis.
Yes.
And I can't
very much so,
think
yeah.
about one representation of a non-binary or even ambiguous character in the main cast of a game of the recent years or more in the past. And I think voice and voice acting is could be one good way to encompass gendered ambiguity into the shown characters without addressing it super directly and to leave a big question mark in the game design.
Yeah, thank you for this comment. Very much so. Is this on? Yeah. And I wanted to mention, actually, in a different paper, I kind of addressed the androgynous voice that in games, not only are characters very heteronormative and cis, typically, but when you do have androgynous voices, they're always sort of voices of robots or evil, of creatures. They're never human. They're other. They're so other. It's like they're really, really marked. So think of voices of artificial intelligence in games or creatures that have had some sort of evil transformation happen, and then they speak with that, middle voice.
The queer coding of the evil character is something unnormal, so it's dangerous. It's often also in Disney movies this happens.
Yes. Yeah, and actually I don't address enough the role of animated movies and voice work in animated movies that we see perpetuated in games,
This is super brief and I don't even just what do you make of the fact that she wears glasses?
She's obviously very smart. Right? Isn't that what we're supposed to take away? She's a sexy librarian in her spare time and a demon-fighting witch in her in the nighttime.
I want to do one remark, probably one question. I just thought about the fading of silent movies. And in silent movies, actually, all the heroes, all the main characters have been female. Nobody's remembering the male characters. And it changed when sounding movies came. So then you remember the main character is a male and then is accompanied by a woman. And I don't know if you heard about in German, it's not game, but it's media. In German, they have a so-called Slomka effect. Slomka, she is a news moderator, what you said. She's doing the news, the main news of public anchor woman.
Mm-hmm.
Anchor woman. Yeah. And she has a deep voice like this. And this is now already transferred, that if you want to say the truth, if it's very serious, if it's very solid, if it's really true, you have to speak in her voice.
Right.
And now a lot of women imitating this, and they're getting problems with their vocal cords because it's so deep. Mm-hmm. So it's completely the opposite what you have mentioned in the media land now, that the deep voice is connected to the truth.
Well, it's the masculine deep voice. It's the BBC voice. It's the radio voice, and James Halberstam calls this female masculinity, the voice of female masculinity, where in order to be taken seriously, female anchors on the radio and television, and politicians too. There's really interesting studies about how Margaret Thatcher dropped a few octaves. Kathy Kennedy talked about this. And Hillary Clinton and other politicians have sort of dropped their voices and indeed had problems with the voice box, exhaustion, and so on. And what can I say about it? To me, that's not a good necessarily trend, because we are still emphasizing the fact that only the deep voice is to be believed and listened to. And the higher female voices are still just noise.
I have a question too. So playing games or watching movies is some kind of escaping reality or going into a fantasy. And I'm wondering, as you said, this industry is very big and they want to make money with it. Would it lose appeal for the players if we if we go out from making these characters so over the top and so kind of special in a way, so that people would say, well, why would I play a game where the people are depicted in the kind of normal way. Why would I play that? I want to play a game where the character is super special, you know?
Did you want to respond?
Yes.
Yeah.
To directly respond to this, I think the game industry, for example, storytelling-wise, already has shown that it has good capabilities. For example, I remember a title called, I don't remember the title, but it has a very big part of immersiveness and great fluidity in storytelling, but also clinging to a narrative, but giving you room to explore the world and so on. So the games I'm referring to are, for example, doing stuff film industry as the big narrators of our times aren't capable to do, and going new ways and exploring new ways. So I think games are a way to stay in public mention. God, my English is bad today. In the awareness of the public, but also incorporate new ways of storytelling and characterizing figures and so on. This War of Mine was the game. It is not that old, but it has a good new and kind of progressive approach to storytelling and fluidity in storytelling.
But was it accepted by the community? Was it like a successful game?
For its size, pretty much, yes. It was a very small development group, an independent development group, but the resonance in the echo in the receiving was very big for the size the group and the game was developed in.
And it's important to note there isn't one community that gets to dictate the terms of how game development, or what is good game development, what is a good gaming experience. I think it's fair to say that should Bayonetta be a more realistic or appropriate or complex person, it might lose some appeal. It will gain other appeal. I mean, it will gain another audience. Isn't that important? And also, entertainment is escapism, but it's also, as the whole corpus of media studies has shown, it also creates a reality. I mean, we experience that immersion and that escape, and in turn, we become reality, or we create reality in its image. So it is really important, and that's why people talk about representation. So economics are not the only important metric here, right?
Thank you. There's time for one question.
Thank you. Thanks for a very interesting presentation. Your presentation made me think of children's stories and the issues that certainly about gender existed in children's stories, in paper, I mean. And how this media now, instead of making the problem less, it augmented it. I'm fascinated to realize that the introduction of the voice has made even more obvious the problem, I think, because in the children in the past reading a story, they brought their own stereotypes, and some of them could have bad, more prejudiced approaches from their parents, but some of them could have better. So, but now the sound designer or the game itself imposes a very clear approach to the character in terms of gender. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I agree.
All right. Thank you very much for your questions and your participation, and thanks again to you, Milena.
Thank
It is
you.
a topic